Welcome, everyone, with our experimental two-venue meeting. We know you're all here because you're very concerned about this experimental sewage sludge pyrolysis biochar project, incinerator in disguise. So without further ado, let's turn our attention to our expert speakers. After each speaker, there will be time for questions. And first at the Strand Theater in Hudson Falls, and then at the Moreau Community Center. And we'll have time for questions afterwards as well, hopefully. So the first speaker will be Laura Orlando. Laura Orlando is a civil engineer and a sewage expert who has been fighting the land spreading of sewage sludge for many years. She also is she also teaches at the Boston University School of Public Health. Environmental health is her specialty there. And she also works for Just Zero, which is a national nonprofit advocacy organization working for zero waste systems. So without further ado, Laura will talk about sewage systems and why sewage is always a contaminated material.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. I'm glad to speak about sewers. And thanks for the introduction, Tracy. I want to give you just an overview of the landscape. What goes in, what goes out, what does treatment mean, what doesn't it mean? And I'll show us a few slides to do that and then leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to share my screen right now. And somebody speak up if this isn't showing up.
It's beautiful.
Great. It's really important to start with definitions. As I read the permit applications from Saratoga Biochar, there was a lot of mixing up of language, I guess you could say. And the language is really, really important when we care about what's going into the air or what's going into the soil, right? So let's just start the sewers, underground system of pipes that carry industrial waste, waste from manufacturing facilities, hospitals, road runoff, shops like a car repair shop, landfill leachate, which is either trucked to the wastewater treatment plant and sometimes actually piped there. Household are what's called domestic waste. So like human excreta, that which is flushed down the toilet, that which goes down the shower. And it's really important to remember that sewers have an industrial input, right? And so it's not only human excreta, feces, urine, by any means. Sewage, whatever goes into the sewer, right? We use water to transport that material. You flush your toilet. Industrial processes use water to move whatever they're moving into those pipes that in the United States go to a sewage treatment plant, right? That's the place where the sewage is piped and processed to meet permitting requirements. So in the United States, all sewers have what's called a NPDES, NPDES permit. Glen Falls has a NPDES permit. New York City's 14 wastewater treatment plants have NPDES permits. And those permits, it's called the National Pollution NPDE I'm forgetting the D, elimination system. Anyway, the NIPD's permit says exactly what treatment means. In by treatment, it's the treatment of the wastewater. Okay, I'm going to get into that in a little bit. It's not the treatment of the sewage sludge. So wastewater treatment plants, we're trying to meet certain goals, certain treatment goals that are established in the permit, so that whatever receiving body of water, because that treated wastewater is then discharged into a receiving body of water. The Atlantic Ocean, if it's here in Boston, the Niagara River, creeks, Lake Michigan, whatever body of water is nearby. And sewage sludge is the unwanted byproduct of wastewater treatment. It's always rich in pollutants like toxic metals, PFAS, or so-called forever chemicals that Denise is going to talk more about, and other synthetic chemicals. Biosolids is a word that came out of a 1990 competition to rename sewage sludge. Sometimes the word is used to describe treated sewage sludge. And by treated, what's meant is volume reduction, so less of it. An anaerobic digester, for instance, can reduce the volume of sewage sludge by approximately 40, 50%. Removing of water, most sewage sludge, all sewage sludge is majority water. And so maybe 10%, 8, 10, 12% solids. And so there are processes to take some of that polluted water out, and that goes back into the wastewater treatment plant because it's easier to handle the sludge when it has less water. And the reduction of pathogens and odor control. That's what treatment means. Volume reduction, reducing the amount of water and sludge, reducing the pathogens, and dealing with odor control. The EPA uses biosolids in sewage sludge interchangeably these days. Pyrolysis is a thermal process in the absence of oxygen. It is not used to manage sewage sludge anywhere in the United States except for one small plant in Redwood City, California. In that plant, the proposed pyrolysis plant in Moreau would manage more than 50 times the amount of every day, more than 50 times the amount of sewage sludge than at this small plant. And if sludge is a problem all over the country, it's an unwanted byproduct of wastewater treatment. It always has toxins in it, always. And there is no treatment at the wastewater treatment plant that removes those toxins. If the toxins are partitioned to out of the water, they'll go into the sewage sludge. So toxins that, chemicals that don't like water, that are hydrophobic, will make their way over to the sludge. And so, so it's not 100% either way, but it is reliable, it is certain that there will be toxic chemicals in sewage sludge. It's millions and millions and millions of tons of sludge are produced in the United States every year. And it costs about 50% of the whole treatment process to deal with the sludge. And so it's a lot of money, billions and billions of dollars. And if it could be brought to a pyrolysis plant and poof, made, safe, and those toxic chemicals would go away and there'd be less sludge, we would see pyrolysis plants all over the country. We don't see that. Those that have been built have failed. And as I mentioned, there's one small one in California. Saratoga Biochar's final product is what they're wanting in their permits is what's called an EQ Class A biosolids. carbon fertilizer, biochar, all of that, you've got to focus on what they're producing is this, what they wish to produce is sludge, a sludge that has fewer metals. That's the EQ. So wait, sludge is regulated in the Clean Water Act. All sludge that's land applied, incinerated, or landfilled is regulated. And the concern is with pathogens, odor, vector control, really flies is what we're talking about. So odor, pathogens, and metals, okay, like lead, mercury, etc. And not toxic chemicals, right? And so what Saratoga Biochar's final product is, it would, if they can get there, would be what's called an EQ Class A biosolid. It's sewage sludge that can be pretty much spread anywhere and not tracked. And you know, as mentioned, PFAS are not regulated, and other synthetic chemicals. They're not regulated. They're not treated or otherwise processed in this for reduction in the sewage treatment plant or during sludge treatment. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about PFAS, but where I want to direct your attention is sources of PFAS, this indirect waste related. Primary sources of PFAS are landfill leachates and wastewater treatment plants. And it's the PFAS are in the effluent, the treated wastewater, or the sewage sludge. And those industrial manufacturing, textile, metal plating, those plants are hooked up to the sewer system. That's where the PFAS is coming from. It's coming from industrial sources or landfills. It's not coming from your toilet. So what goes into the sewer? That's called influent. And so households, businesses, industrial manufacturing facilities and manufacturing facilities, road runoff, landfill leachate. What comes out? Two products. The effluent, which is the treated wastewater, which is what is regulated. That's what we are aiming for when we say wastewater treatment. We're trying to make that, we're trying to deal with especially the nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, in the wastewater that when added to a lake or a pond would change the aquatic ecosystem because it would give that water nutrients that would use up the oxygen. And so, like, for instance, fish could all die. Plants could grow. You might get huge algal blooms. And then the other byproduct is sewage sludge. And so when we talk about sewage treatment, what we're focused on is treating or otherwise processing the wastewater. And we're focused on what are called conventional pollutants, oil, grease, the organics that I mentioned, like nitrogen, suspended solids, pathogens, right? You don't see a big long list of chemicals there. Treatment is not focused on the sewage sludge, and that which ends up in the sewage sludge isn't treated by anaerobic, chemicals, isn't treated, meaning reduced or destroyed by any of the processes that are referred to as treating sewage sludge. So these are really, really important concepts to get. And this is a, messy, complicated picture, but really I wanted to give you some idea what's happening at a wastewater treatment plant. This is here in Boston, and it's it's the second largest wastewater treatment plant in the country. And really what we're focused on here is letting that the sewage that comes into the wastewater treatment plant, having solids settle out, having things that float up, there's a screen, so rags and sticks and stuff like that are taken out, thrown into trucks that go to landfills. Then there's pure oxygen is put into what's called this, is part of the secondary treatment operation. And they're doing that because they're using bacteria that are going to survive now because there's pure oxygen being injected into the wastewater. And that bacteria help reduce, you know, the putrescibles, that nitrogen and the, you know, the organics that would actually make those plants grow in receiving waters. And they can remove maybe 85% of the organics that are in wastewater. And then there's disinfection. So sodium hypochlorite, chlorine, big dosage of chlorine, then out goes, that's the effluent, that's the treated wastewater. The sludge is the stuff that settles on the bottom of those tanks. And that is thickened. And at Deer Island, they use different processes to thicken it, take some of the water out of it, and then they put it in these giant anaerobic digesters. And that means what they're doing is they're creating conditions where the sewage sludge is worked on by bacteria that thrive in the absence of oxygen, and that reduces the volume, and then that sewage sludge here goes to a plant where it's dried, it's pelletized, and like these rotary rum dryers, and then it's shipped out all over the country. That sewage sludge, there's data on, it's loaded with PFAS and all kinds of other chemicals. The EPA's own studies show over 700 different synthetic chemicals in sewage sludge. And there's no magic switch that they can flip on to get rid of those chemicals. Wastewater treatment is focused on the nutrient load of that influent, because when it goes out, the aim is to have it be less damaging to aquatic ecosystems. And the sludge is the stuff that's left over. That's it. So,
Thank you.
yeah, you bet.
So does anyone in this room have questions for Laura? Okay, no questions here. Gina, are there questions in Moreau for Laura? Or Tony? Yeah, we have the Moreau Community Center. So if anyone has questions, Gina, do you want to go to the computer and state the question? I see some movement there. I think she's collected some questions. And there's a microphone, and hopefully she can share those questions.
Welcome to there, and you can ask the question.
Can you read that? Read the draft there.
Let me work on this first.
Okay. The first question is, does the Wheelabrator burn plant in Hudson Falls burn sewage waste? If
Okay.
so, who approved it?
Let me answer that question because Laura would not know about the Hudson Falls trash incinerator. It does burn sewage sludge, and this is something we can take up after we win on Saratoga Biochar. Glens Falls has a wastewater treatment plant. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Glens Falls has a wastewater treatment plant that treats the sewage from Moreau, from parts of Queensbury and South Glens Falls, and I'm not sure, there might be some other place, I cannot remember. And they had a sewage sludge incinerator. There are sewage sludge incinerators in many cities around the country, but Glens Falls closed theirs because it was old and because EPA made the standards for mercury emissions stricter, and they could not meet the mercury emission standards. So they closed it, and instead they truck it, I think it's every 2 days, to the Wheelabrator trash incinerator in Hudson Falls. So that PFAS is also going through the stacks. But the amount of sewage sludge that would be burned by Saratoga Biochar is many, many times higher, 720 tons a day. It's equivalent to 15% of New York State's sewage sludge. It's a huge quantity. So while it's a problem that Wheelabrator Hudson Falls is burning sewage sludge, it would be a much greater problem if Saratoga Biochar jumped on that bandwagon and burned, sewage sludge from Long Island and New York City and lots of other places. So that's why the focus is on Saratoga Biochar at this point. And the alternative that the city of Glens Falls, that Bill Collins, who's currently the mayor, was pushing as a city council member, he was very excited about this, was a public-private partnership, which would probably have been with Casella. And there was no company mentioned, but this was just an idea, to make it into a fertilizer, and that would have been sold or given to farmers and I live in Washington County, and we're the county that has farmers, not Warren County. So that's how, in fact, that's a good segue, but there may be some more questions. So we'll do the questions first. That's a good segue into Murray McBride, because that's how I met Murray. But we will see if there's other questions from Moreau. Dina?
There's just one more question, and he'll read his question out now.
Sure, okay.
Hi, my name is Ken Brooks. I was asked to read my own question. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay, fine. For contaminated industrial wastewater being discharged to a POTW, wouldn't such water be subject to categorical pretreatment standards and need to be treated prior to discharge to the treatment plant?
well, Laura, you take that question.
Yeah, sure. The pre-treatment program is a broken program. It's by and large voluntary, and for instance, pre-treatment for landfill leachate, when not all landfill leachate, not all deliveries of landfill leachate require it to be pre-treated, but what that means is reducing the nutrient load in the landfill leachate, not reducing the PFAS, not reducing the other thousands of chemicals that are in the landfill leachate. It's taking that
Excuse me, sir?
load from it's dealing with what's called biological oxygen demand and other nutrient loads. And so there are some, pre-treatment, if the material is highly corrosive, explosive, for example, or it will damage the actual wastewater treatment process itself, then there are quite strict rules about it, because they need they can't have that plant shut down. And so, but the rest of the pre-treatment is not about removing these toxins. For instance, there is no pre-treatment for the forever chemicals. And so, it's a program that is not protective of human health and the environment.
And in
Sounds
fact,
good though.
the Glens Falls wastewater treatment plant they tried very hard to figure out where the mercury was coming from, which made it impossible to operate their sewage sludge incinerator, and they couldn't find out. They did some inspections of dental offices and they gave up. So, you can't ask a producer, a generator of a toxic substance in wastewater to treat it if you don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah, Boston has a new there's a new permit in process for the wastewater treatment plant here in Boston. And one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to ask that certain facilities that they know are adding PFAS to the wastewater treatment plant, they're going to ask them to test that material. So there's, in Boston's done a pretty good has been pretty good about going up the treatment pipe to look for molybdenum or something and figure out who's dumping a particular heavy metals into the wastewater treatment plant. I mean, again, not perfect. So there are some things that can be done, but you've got a drain, you've got pipes, people are gonna load whatever they can into that, into the sewer, and that's what they do.
Okay, next question. Thank you. Are there other questions or should we move on? Those were good questions. Okay, we're going to go to Murray. Thank you so much, Laura. That was very informative. And Dr. Murray McBride is a recently retired Cornell soil scientist professor whose specialty is metals. And oh, wait, okay, yeah, good. And I met Murray by phone when Bill Collins was talking about, wouldn't it be great to have a public-private partnership to make the sewage sludge into a fertilizer? And I was horrified, and Murray was very helpful, and so I will turn it over to Murray.
Okay, oops,
Yes. Yeah, that's good.
there we are. Okay. Do I advance the slides or how does that work?
I think Laura will.
Laura will, okay. Yeah, well, this is my title slide, and my emphasis has always been, because of my background and interest in soil health and soil pollution, is the effect that these sewage sludge products may have on farmland. So let's go to the next slide. So I don't need to say much about this sewage sludge generation, because I think Laura covered why we have so many contaminants of concern in sewage sludge. These influence into the wastewater treatment plant are from homes, hospitals, research facilities, et cetera, as well as street runoff, which you have to think about in urban areas where there's a lot of lead on the surface. And there are additional metals actually coming in from plumbing, various pipe corrosion processes. And these include lead, zinc, and copper, for example. And some industrial discharges to wastewater treatment plants are permitted. We just had a brief discussion about that, the so-called pre-treatment program, which is very, well, somewhat ineffective, as was pointed out actually by the EPA Office of Inspector General some years ago. There is substantial, what should I say, illegal dumping into treatment plants. The contaminants are preferentially concentrated from wastewater into the sludge. At least 90 to 95% of persistent organic chemicals and the toxic metals end up in the sludge, not in the treated water, of course. And the biodegradation during this process of sludge production is pretty minimal for a lot of the organic chemicals. And the other thing to keep in mind, at least from the point of view of if you're a farmer wanting to use this material, is that the quality of the sludge can vary quite a lot over time, over months at any single wastewater treatment plant. Next slide. So present day, the DEC in New York and US EPA rules basically only regulate 9 metals under EPA or 10 under DEC. Heavy metals having sludge quality standards based on parts per million in the sludge, and or soil loading limits. These are the number of pounds of lead or cadmium or whatever would be permitted to put on agricultural soil per acre per year. No synthetic organic chemicals are actually regulated under the 503 rule. And the limits that were created for these metals are based on a very old 1993 risk assessment, which in our view, at Cornell at least, we're using inadequate data and non-cautious assumptions. There's the other problem that present-day sludges commonly contain what I would call exotic chemicals or even exotic metals that are not regulated simply because back when these rules were made, EPA research had not looked for these chemicals, or at least had not detected them. I guess you could say the PFAS chemicals would fall under exotic, because even though they were in existence in the 1950s, they didn't really come into any obvious inspection until some decade or two ago. Next slide. Yeah, I just this slide I won't spend much time on, but I just listed here 7 of the 9 regulated metals, and I kind of highlighted copper and zinc and lead and cadmium. And the reason I did that is because copper and zinc are 2 metals that concern me, because those, first of all, tend to be at the highest concentrations of any of all other metals in sewage sludges. That is, they're often at thousands of parts per million, not always, but very often. And when these metals are in sludges applied to land over a periods of years, they can reach concentrations that are toxic to plants. That is, they're phytotoxic. So they represent some issue for soil health. But it's a relatively long-term problem, and they're not terribly toxic to humans, so they don't get a lot of attention. On the other hand, lead and cadmium are toxic to animals and humans, and these lead is present in sludges generally at levels much higher than in soil. So whenever we apply these waste sludge materials to land, to farmland, we are increasing the soil concentrations of lead, which is definitely not a good thing. Cadmium is a special concern. It's usually not particularly at high levels in sludges or sludge products, but on the other hand, it's very plant available. So when it gets into soil, the uptake into food crops is very likely to occur. So I just showed here 4 of the metals that might be of greatest concern in, say, a biochar made from sludges. Mercury is listed here, and mercury we know is very toxic, but on the other hand, generally we don't find particularly high concentrations of mercury in most sludges. Although, as Tracy pointed out, that isn't always the case. All right, let's go to the next slide then. So to summarize these points, most sewage sludge and sewage sludge products are going to, if they're used as basically replacements for fertilizers, that is, they're used rather than conventional fertilizers or lime materials or manures, they're going to load more heavy metals onto the farmland than would the more conventional materials. Metal loading on farmland from agronomic applications of sludge is unpredictable because of the variability of sludge composition from month to month and year to year, as I mentioned. Now, if you make biochar from sewage sludge pyrolysis, these will actually contain, the biochars will contain higher concentrations of most heavy metals, although not all, which we can talk about later, I guess. But a metal like copper or lead or zinc will be higher in the biochar than it was in the parent sludge material. Okay, next slide. So my last slide is really just a summary on why I and a number of my colleagues at Cornell have been opposed to sewage sludge products being used on farms in New York. Why that is inadvisable. First of all, we have the toxic organic pollutants, including the PFAS, but we also have a whole range of these recalcitrant or resistant chemicals, such as brominated fire retardants. These may transfer and have transferred and bioaccumulated into livestock, into the animal fat and into meat and into milk. Now, crops can take up some of the toxic metals like cadmium and even some of the synthetic chemicals and contaminate the food chain. You can have the effect of metals like copper and zinc building up in soil over time. These metals aren't going away. I mean, we talk about the forever chemicals, but copper and zinc are also forever. they build up in soils and they damage soil fertility at some level. That usually takes decades of application, but it can and has occurred. Most of the chemicals in present-day sludges have not been tested for toxicity or impacts on soils, animals, or humans. And of course, you have the potential for contamination of wells and surface waters by nutrients, and that would include nitrate, for example, or even phosphorus, and persistent organic pollutants. And we now know that PFAS can reach groundwater. And finally, despite the fact that the application of these waste materials on farms is considered by DEC to be a beneficial use, which means recycling of nutrients, in fact, at least on our big dairy farms in New York, these nitrogen and phosphorus imports to these modern livestock farms represents a nutrient excess and is actually an environmental liability. It's not a benefit. We'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Marie. So do we have questions from, let's go to Moreau first. Any questions? And all this is being recorded and will be available tomorrow on YouTube if all goes well. Okay, any questions here? Okay. Okay, yes, speak up really loud and I'll repeat it.
Define the word biochar. I'm not sure what biochar is and what is the difference between that and sludge.
Okay, we might not define it right now, but we'll define it in a future, with a future speaker, if that's okay. Okay, so the question was, can you define biochar? And what I said is we'll define, another speaker will define biochar.
Yeah, okay, I'm not the biochar expert.
Right,
so-
right. I think our next speaker is Denise. So thank you very much. That was really informative.
We have another question here.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yes.
Can COVID be found in human waste sludge? And then, can it be removed?
No, I think Laura is going to take that question. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the remnants of the virus are can be found in wastewater. And so what you'll see is you can see if there's spikes of COVID in a particular town or in a dormitory at a college or something by looking for the remnants of that virus. But it's not the SARS-CoV-2 virus in its entirety. So you can't get sick. You can't get COVID from handling sewage sludge. Okay, so it's not a live virus in the wastewater or the sludge.
Thank you.
Another question from the floor here is Governor Hochul concerned about our area's high cancer rate, particularly with our young men and women? She said we're a protected community.
So the reason we're having this forum with experts tonight is because the 2 public hearings that the DEC is holding on Saratoga biochar permits will be tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday at 6 o'clock, one virtual and one at the South Glens Falls High School. Our job as concerned residents, concerned citizens, is to let the DEC and Governor Hochul know that this is unacceptable because of our high cancer rates and similar problems and the high burden of respiratory problems given the other industrial polluters nearby. So that is our job.
Okay, and another one here. How would New York State restructuring of PFAS in consumer products impact use of the biosludge?
I will just say that today I spent the day at the Capitol and the Legislative Office building with the PFAS-free New York Lobby Day. And we were lobbying on a package of 4 or 5 bills. There is so much needed to be done to turn off the tap with these toxic forever chemicals. So I think we should we don't maybe need to talk about that more right now, but Denise will have some very important things to say on that topic, I believe. So let's turn to Denise now. Let me introduce her. Denise Trabblc-Pointer is a chemical engineer. I don't have, who worked for DuPont and its subsidiaries for 42 years, doing environmental compliance and occupational health. And when she left, she went to work as a volunteer for Sierra Club Michigan chapter on toxics and remediation. And she is a really helpful person who's working with communities and groups around the country on these kinds of threats. And she's able to analyze permit applications and permits and do things that most lay people cannot. So she has been involved in analyzing the impacts of this project for over a year, and I'll turn it over to Denise.
Thank you. I don't really define biochar in this, but I'll tell you very quickly that what I do know is it's basically biochar is like if there's a forest fire, that's called terra preta, and it's real biochar, and it's in the Amazons. It's very fertile. It makes for very fertile soil. You know, the biosolids we're talking about here are obviously quite different. They're going to put wood in with the sewage sludge, and both media, both feedstock might have PFAS in them. So, and other chemicals that are actually manufactured when biochar is created. That part I will go into. So, thank you for having me, and thank you, Tracy, for the introduction. Matter of fact, Tracy and Michael and I had a call one day, and we were talking about the lack of information that we have on this. I mean, real data hasn't been provided to us. And Tracy was like, you know, like, what are we going to do about it? And I said, well, it's some kind of grand experiment in the community. And before I could even finish it, she said, they're going to be the guinea pigs. And that's the truth. We don't know enough, but I'm going to give you what I know with what I have found. There's just not enough information. To our knowledge, and as Laura mentioned, there's only one full-scale biosolids biochar facility in Redwood, California. I know from the community and from Tracy in particular, there's not a lot of faith that the DEC will fail, or that there's a lot of faith that the DEC will fail to hold SBS to the terms and conditions of their permit. And I have, in fact, looked at a lot of permits, and I see a lot of things that should be there and aren't. That'll be written comments. SBS has not provided analytical data on the hazards of the chemicals of the sewage sludge that they're going to pyrolyze. We don't know anything about. We just know that it's going to come from various sources. It's going to be variable. And we know enough to know that it will contain PFAS, but there's no provisions in the permit for them to do that, to test it before or after. Just mainly the same thing. The other thing that struck me when I looked at the permit application is that SBS and their contract company that put the package together, they quote a lot of studies, or they quote one in particular all the time that was put together by the sewage sludge industry's main lobby organization. And then when they look at other studies, they either misquote, misrepresent, or misinterpret the other studies. So that's our big concern. And I'm not going to go through all of this because I just want to right now highlight what I found in the list of, and this isn't all of them. I got a couple pages and this isn't all of them, but what I'm seeing in common is that most of these have a target organ that includes the deep lungs and the respiratory system. And my understanding of some of the disadvantaged communities in the area, there is a lot of people with respiratory type issues. This will only add to it. They're gonna have particulate matter, the really small stuff that gets deep into the lungs. They're gonna emit nitrous oxides or NOx, and those are very irritating and causes coughs and shortness of breath, fluid buildup. Sulfur dioxides, SOx, same thing, very strong and irritating to the mucous membranes, cough and reflex bronchial constriction. Murray hit on just a little bit, and it obviously is quite toxic, but it included with its symptoms is the cough, chest pain, or difficulty of breathing. Hydrogen chloride and hydrogen sulfide are both very irritating and maybe even can burn the respiratory system. Hydrogen fluoride, you might know, is that rotten egg smell. And if you're around a petroleum plant or a fracking tower, or you drive through Detroit on I-75, you smell it. So, and it can be quite hazardous. I guess I had it twice. What happens when they burn biosolids, and it happens in nature as well. When you burn it to char, you end up with what they call polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAH, and naphthalene is one of those. It is a carcinogen. Some of them are carcinogens, and they also are associated with reduced lung function, and it makes worse asthma and people with COPD and other lung diseases. So it just makes it worse. And then we've talked a lot about, we've mentioned several times, perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, but in particular, PFOA is what's going to be regulated on this facility. PFOA is Teflon. I worked in Teflon, so I can tell you that, and I'm like rotting from the inside out from having been exposed to it. But what I was surprised to find actually was that it also irritates asthma and airway hyperresponsive disorders, and inflammation has been reported. There's a lot of association between asthma-related outcomes in children and PFAS. But the other thing I'll point out about PFAS in general is you see the other things that it hits: liver, kidney, colon, preeclampsia, high blood pressure in pregnant women. There is not another chemical that I'm aware of, and I've done a lot of toxicology type work as well, that hits so many organs as PFAS does. So besides respiratory, it's a whole lot of other bad things. So as I mentioned here, people with heart or lung disease, older adults, babies, children, and are particularly at risk. There'll probably be, unfortunately, odor issues from this facility because of the sulfides and the acetic acid and the things that are, well, the H2S especially, but hydrogen fluoride could be a problem. So it will cause unreasonable interference with the comfort and enjoyment of life. That's what the regulations say. And if you have an odor, you need to call it in because it could be bad. So all of these things that I talk about, because they impact the same target organ in the body, and in this case, the respiratory system, are cumulative. And it isn't just cumulative with all the different chemicals, it's cumulative if you breathe it, if you ingest it, if you get it on your skin. So there's all kinds of ways of being exposed is the point, and it's cumulative. And I'm going to explain what I've done here. And it's going to be a little dry at first, but you need to kind of have a basic understanding of what I did here. Again, I say about how it's can come from many sources. What is provided and presented by SBS regarding anticipated emission levels is not supported by any demonstrable data. So again, we don't have the data. they modeled what they expect is gonna be the emissions and how far they're gonna go. And the air mod system is actually a decent modeling system, but it's only as good as the data you put in it. So, you know, what we know about SBS is it's probably not great data. It is anticipated practice to perform a calculation of measured or estimated emissions from numerous chemicals. And it's an acceptable practice. And again, we talk about the respiratory system. So what you do is you calculate a hazard index. And I did run a hazard index using the emissions levels that were estimated and modeled by SBS, and that could reach two identified disadvantaged communities. And Michael is going to talk more about that. But the two communities are Glen Falls and Hudson Falls.
Or a portion of Glens Falls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see, yeah, I don't live there, but I
Right,
know
right,
what the
right.
map looks like. One's over here and one's up here. The hazard index is basically a ratio of the potential exposure. So it's that number that SBS came up with divided by the level at which no adverse impacts are expected. And if the hazard index, when you sum them all up, if it's less than 1, then they basically think that there's no adverse health effects expected because of the exposure, but that's on healthy individuals. So I am reinforcing that young children, elderly, and people with pre-existing respiratory issues like COPD and asthma and emphysema would likely be affected at much lower levels. So the fact that the hazard index comes out less than 1 doesn't mean, you know, everything's great. In the workplace, when I was, besides environmental, I did occupational health. And you gotta excuse me, I don't know what's going on here. Sorry. But I was responsible for people's health in the workplace, and I monitored people, and I used this hazard index system, and we had criteria back when we were DuPont, at least, that at 50% of an acceptable limit, we needed to look a little closer. Is there something we could do with engineered controls like ventilation or put additional protective equipment on people? Well, when you're in your home in a community, you're basically captive, and there's nobody going to walk in and say, how can I help? Can I fix your ventilation? Can I help? So I'm suggesting that I'm going to use the same criteria here as I did in the workplace as it relates to the disadvantaged communities. So this what I call the screening levels that I use, which is you take the amount that they say is going to hit that community, and then you divide it by whatever the acceptable level is, which is, in this case, I looked at the most restrictive of 3 different sources. Most of them are DEC because there's not a lot of good air emission limits out there for short term or 1 hour. So I did use DEC in most of it, but if I found the EPA regional screening levels, if they were lower, I used them. So the way it came out was that Hudson Falls came out as a 0.615, and Glen Falls was 0.21, and that's just strictly the way. I'll show you the picture of it in a minute, but that's strictly because, you know, they modeled that the most of the emissions are going to go towards Glen Falls, and that some would still be going to, I'm sorry, to Hudson Falls, where the Wheelabrator is, would go that direction, and that's why their hazard index is higher. That's really all it is. Then I did short term. The short term came out at obviously over the hazard index at 1.5 and 1.33, I think it is. It's covered up. I can't see it, but I did look at, I did note that there's homes. Well, I'll go to my map because that's the easiest. This is the map that they put in their report that really doesn't show you much because you can't see any of the homes or anything. So I do Google Maps and I map everything. So this is where the Saratoga Biochar solids or solutions place is supposed to be. The blue markers, ignore them. I use them to draw my circle, which is about a 1 mile radius. This is not perfect, but you can see that there's a lot of homes. You know, the closest, I think this was like a half mile this way and a quarter mile this way. There's a home. There's homes right in here.
There are
So there's
people,
people, I'm sorry.
there are people less, around 1,000 feet from the site as well. Their homes
Yeah.
aren't shown here, but there are people.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Family.
Now I'm gonna talk about the modeling, but what I'll tell you is, I did look at, area emissions closer to the facility. They had figures that would show the kind of the property line for the proposed facility. And then they had different colors that kind of explain most of the emissions went this way and some went this way. But the higher levels were pretty close to the plant and they generally didn't go much farther than right here. The point at which I can't see on Google Maps anyway that there's any homes. And I hope that's true because the levels were quite high. And the other thing I point out here is the Hudson River runs right through it. And you'll know why I point that out in a minute. So this kind of is a pictorial thing that shows what Laura talked about. She really explained it very well. The cyclical nature of PFAS in particular, because they don't break down in the environment. Mercury is another one. The thing to point out here is in this, besides the fact that the emissions are going to go towards these homes, the emissions also will deposit, and they'll deposit right into the river. And so you'll end up with, you probably already have PFAS in the river, but you'll end up with even more from these emissions. And the other thing to point out is instead of biosolids, this will be the biochar that they're talking about putting on farmland. So you see all the things that go into the wastewater treatment plant, and a lot of it, as Laura mentioned, doesn't come out, or doesn't come out in the water, but mostly in the biosolids. So this is important information about, you know, what's proposed and what this facility is going to be. The planned biosolids and wood feedstock will likely contain PFAS. Like I said, we know that the biosolids, most biosolids have it, but a lot of wooden pulp, paper mills and things like that also use PFAS in the past. And so recycled wood and all that, which they propose to use, could also have it. The thermal oxidizer that they plan to control emissions, they did actually improve it. They're going to put in a multi-stage thermal oxidizer, and that's what's going to treat the emissions. Because if they say it's not going to be in the biochar, which we think it will, it's going to be in the air. So it's got to go through the thermal oxidizer. They're putting in a multi-stage where the front part of it has higher temperatures. Then it's cooled immediately, and then it goes through 2 more stages. And we believe strongly that there'll be products of incomplete combustion, or PICs they are called, and they're just pieces of PFAS and small molecules that reform themselves in the stack and in the cooling chambers. And they end up coming right out of the stack and they deposit on the ground. And there are numerous examples of that happening where it got actually into 3M in Cordova. Illinois actually sent enough deposition to the river and to Iowa that got in the drinking water. Now they have to pay to have everybody's have filters on everybody's water, or they have to connect them to a clean source of water. And it's all from air deposition, all of it. Wastewater, is right now, as far as I know, and from what I've seen, is going to the Glen Falls wastewater treatment plant. And Glen Falls sends their biosolids to the Wheelabrator, as Tracy mentioned, in Hudson Falls. I can't read that word again, but from, emissions from SBS and the Wheelabrator incinerator can deposit to the Hudson River.
There
So,
are, let me
ahead.
just interrupt and just say there are 7 Hudson River communities downstream that get their drinking water from the river.
they're right here.
No, they're, yes, right. Thank you. Sorry about that.
I got that from you.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I didn't follow up yet and look at, and maybe you know, Tracy, if any of them have issues with PFAS already or other heavy metals or anything, but I am gonna follow up on that because it's important. There's probably actually more than 15,000 PFAS compounds. And New York, DEC is only requiring SBS to meet emissions limits for the one I talked about. Which is crazy. If you look at the data I've been looking at, there's a whole lot more than one. The pyrolysis process will create a bioaccumulative contaminant that I mentioned, the PAH. The SBS plan does not describe ventilation that is protective of workers. I can't look at anything without thinking about worker health. And they're not, let's just say the ventilation system is, there's gonna be a lot of sick people working in that plant if they don't make it better. The SBS plan does not describe, oh, I already said that. And there is a net increase in hazardous air pollutants that could impact the disadvantaged communities. And again, Michael will probably talk about that. So just in sum, it's a bad idea, right? It's this grand experiment with the community as guinea pigs, and it's a bad idea. And I think everybody that's listening probably agrees with that, unless SBS got it snuck in somewhere.
Well,
And that's it. Thank you.
thank you, Denise. Let's see if there's any questions. And I will just say, sometimes there's talk about, well, when it's open, the plant will not open. We are together going to stop this plant, but we do have to anticipate what it would do to our communities and our health and the river. So any questions in Moreau? I see someone has their hand raised. Do you want to go up to the computer and ask your question? Or read the question?
My name's Albert Carden. So is DEC going into this biochar blind, like New York is going into this marijuana open smoke shops, and we don't have any laws to test anyone for marijuana? So you said that DEC doesn't really have any parameters that they stick to. So I'm getting the feeling that they're not going to have any enforcement of anything. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'll let Tracy answer most of that, but I just want to say that they probably did get more information than they made public. Maybe they saw the background information on how they came up with the emissions and things like that. But yeah, I'm really disappointed in what I saw that they think was okay as a draft permit. So I'll let Tracy take it from there.
I'm going to give an example. There were several notices of incomplete application. That's a term that DEC uses when a company applies to build something. and DEC doesn't feel like they have enough information. So DEC asked, they had a long list, like 25 different things they asked for. And one of them was a list of municipalities where they would get the sewage sludge from. And they also, DEC also asked for analytic data, so lab tests of what, the heavy metals, the PFAS, whatever. They did not provide that list. Saratoga Biochar had an excuse of why they didn't provide it, and they didn't provide any analytic data. And I think they gave some averages or something from Casella. That is not adequate. How can you know what the emissions are if you don't know what the stuff you're going to burn has in it? So that's one example. Another example of their inadequate regulation is this plant would only be required to have an outside contractor come in and test the smokestack, test the emissions every 5 years. That's the way New York State, that's the requirement for state permit. And that's what DEC said they would do every 5 years. The permit is 10 years. And it's experimental. It's unproven. There's not a similar plant in New York. And the company has never, I thought that they had done a pilot. They had done a little thing in a lab. All they did was have a contractor make biochar for them out of sewage sludge in the Chicago area. And they give the data on the sewage sludge, how much PFAS was in it. It was very, very low. I think they shopped around and looked for the lowest PFAS containing sewage sludge they could find, sewage sludge that had from a municipality that had no industry and was not accepting landfill leachate. That's my suspicion. And then they had biochar made from that, and it was not PFAS free. But they didn't test for anything else. They didn't test for heavy metals or anything. So it's really shocking and very disappointing. And also the New York State Controller had a report from last year, and I will get that posted on the Clean Air Action Network website and the Not Moreau Facebook page in the near future, so you could use that for your comments. But the New York State Controller did a report where they found that DEC was not adequately enforcing the permits for air polluters. And that was just last year, and nothing has changed. So it does not give me any confidence that DEC will hold them to the terms of the permit, which are too lax. So any other questions?
My second question was, is there any problems at Redwood, California? Biochar.
Yes, I will. Well, Denise, do you want to take a stab at that? And I can say a few words as well.
No, I did not get that far in checking to see, what their complaints and things, but I do know there was, I don't know, Tracy unearthed a few more, but there was quite a few communities and companies trying to build this type of a facility. And in every case, the community stopped it or changed their plan. So,
and there are a couple of pyrolysis plants that were built at wastewater treatment plants, and they're not operating. And we have not found out why. There's one in Schenectady. It's very small, and there's one in near Newark, New Jersey, in a community nearby, and they're not operating. So I might have said that before. I'm sorry, I'm talking to so many people about this. I just want to say that the biochar plant in Redwood City, California, they list on their website many uses for the biochar, like putting it in paints. Do you remember any of the others, Denise?
yeah, concrete, and the other one was really weird. But putting it in paint to me is weird because that's what I did in my whole career, was make paint. Well, the
Anyway,
other was land application, was put it on the
right,
land,
but
sell it as.
that was the last one. So
Mm.
And everyone should know that the European Union has banned sewage sludge biochar. So this is not used all over the world. We have a question here, so let me get that. Yes.
There's a person in Germany that has talked with us that says that biochar doesn't have any great qualities anyway.
So the question was, the people who live within a 1 mile radius, if they are on a private well, could it get in the well?
It has in some place, yeah. I don't know anything about your aquifer there, how deep it is or anything, or how it's connected. But yeah, it's likely it can happen.
Yeah, PFAS is deposited on the soil or on the surface water, like in a river or lake or reservoir. But if it's deposited on the soil, certain PFAS chemicals are very mobile and they're soluble in water, and they will leach over time into the well. So yes, and that can, in North Bennington, there was a factory, and I remember a reporter that I know did a story about this because they had PFAS contamination, and he didn't understand how they could have got it because they were not like right next to the property. And I'm like, from the air, and then it would leach through the soil and it would get in their wells. So the
In
company,
that 3M case, they actually made a circle of 3 miles and 10 miles around it, and they checked everybody's water. And they
yes.
found it in a lot.
And so in North Bennington, Vermont, the company, I think, was required, it might have been from a lawsuit, or it might have been from the state. They were required to pay for the water system the water pipes to be extended to cover these people. So I think, are there any more urgent questions?
I have 4 here, if we have
Oh,
time.
okay. Well, okay, let's go through them.
Was an environmental impact study ever done? And if
No.
so, by what agency?
No.
No.
Environmental impact studies are typically done by the company or the company's consultant, but there are numerous opportunities for public comment, input, hearings, and stuff like that. But in the town of Moreau, there was no environmental impact statement required. That's why our group sued, the Clean Air Action Network sued. Next.
Okay. Our area has not been selected to test for PFAS as areas along the Hudson downstate. Shouldn't a base level be taken for this chemical before this plant is put online?
Definitely, and there would be adequate time to do that if the plant were ever approved. And the plant needs to go, the plant needs to get the go-ahead from the town of Moreau, which is in the process of putting forward a moratorium. As far as I understand, the plant would have to get permits from DEC, and also our lawsuit is on appeal, is going to be appealed next month. So it's not going to be online anytime soon, and we will stop it. I know that all of you feel very strongly. There's hundreds of people who feel strongly. It's not going to happen.
I would say something about even if it doesn't get built. I'm thinking it was Moreau Water Treatment Plant and water. It was a 2021 water quality report, and it did talk about PFAS being in the water. And definitely we could help, or Sierra Club can help sample the river. Talk if you want to, get with Tracy or get with me, we'll help you with that.
Definitely. Moreau gets its drinking water from the Hudson River, as far as I know, above Moreau. So it is above where, it's above Moreau, above where the PCBs were dumped in Hudson Falls, but there's still industrial pollution in Glens Falls. So next question. If there are
Risk of damage and contamination of the industrial park. So no future interest in development? Don't
I-
under, don't
Is the
understand.
industrial park, is that the park that's just west of the,
The site is in the Moreau Industrial Park.
Right.
oh, okay.
I think it's important to note that if this plant were built and it was developed to capacity, there would be over 50 of the biggest dump trucks you can imagine, 14-ton dump trucks, or or more trucks if it's smaller, coming in with sewage sludge every day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Saturday, and that plant is going to be operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, according to the permit. So, would you want to put your business there?
Yes,
Uh,
and that's why the traffic study is so important. I mean, yeah, there's
I
one
mean, on
place.
top of the air emissions and on top of the stink and on top of all of that, in addition to that, it's going to be a noisy, dirty, stinking scene.
Right, and that's something that the people of Moreau are quite aware of and quite concerned about. So let's move on because we have two other speakers. Mike, are you okay going at the end, or are you,
If need be, but I'd like to go
Okay.
sooner as possible.
okay, and Michael, are you okay going at the end? I think.
I'm okay going anytime.
Okay, great. So Mike Ewall, I'd like to introduce, has been an advisor to the Clean Air Action Network since day one, literally. And in 2019, when we formed, Mike Ewall is the co-founder and the executive director of Energy Justice Network, and he's an expert on trash incinerators of all kinds, and air pollution. And without further ado, Mike.
Thank you, Tracy. So let me get my PowerPoint fired up here. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to see how much I can knock out in about 10 minutes here. Might go a little over, but we'll try not to. So Energy Justice, we're a national group based in Philadelphia and help communities like yours all over the country in fighting off dirty energy and waste facilities. And one of the things in my area is, well, I'm surrounded by the biggest cluster of trash incinerators in the country, but one of them, there are 5 around me, and one's the largest. And a block away from it is a sewage sludge incinerator at a plant called Delcora. And they were looking into, they actually hired this company, Material Matters, to look into whether they should switch from sewage sludge incineration to sewage sludge pyrolysis. And I was shocked that they're even thinking of that. Previously, I was telling them, hey, do digesters to shut the incinerator down. And then they go in the direction of doing something way crazier. And that report came back and showed them that pyrolysis is roughly twice as expensive, almost twice as expensive as the incineration they already have going on. So I thought that was interesting to share. Although, unfortunately, digesters, which are what would make more sense for managing sewage sludge before landfilling it, are also quite expensive and maybe even more expensive. I haven't seen good numbers on that yet. This article also just came my way, came out just 3 days ago. And it's about a sewage sludge incinerator in Washington state, where they had about $500,000 of fines from air pollution. And they mentioned that they're going to be shutting down later this year because they don't have the means to comply with the Federal Clean Air Act. And so this same kind of problem would apply to pyrolysis facilities, which are basically incinerators of a different sort, but ones that don't work as well and are even more expensive. Now, a lot of times when we use the word incinerator, the industry fights us to the death over it, and they say, we're not incinerators. You don't know what you're talking about. Pyrolysis is totally different. And even EPA doesn't know what it's talking about. Well, okay, well, let's see what EPA is saying. EPA says that a municipal waste combustor, which they've said in multiple places is synonymous with a municipal waste incinerator. At the bottom, you see the reference to that. So the definition of a municipal waste combustor includes pyrolysis and gasification. Both technologies are very related, and they are both ones that insist that they're not incinerators, because what they're doing is they're just splitting the combustion process into two steps. So when they're talking about pyrolysis or gasification, what they're doing is they turn it into a gas first and then put a pipe in the middle of the process and then burn the gas in the second stage. So if you imagine lighting a piece of paper on fire, if you look closely at it, you'll see there's a little gap between the paper and the flame. And that gap is the paper turning into a gas, and then the gas is what burns. And so in that sense, all combustion is gasification. It's just that it usually happens in one chamber, whereas pyrolysis and gasification are just, that's where they put a pipe in the middle and say, okay, we'll make the gas over here and call it syngas. We'll pretend it's only clean stuff inside. And they never mind all the toxic chemicals that have to go somewhere that are also in there unless they actually filter them out to some degree that they can in the middle process. And then usually the second stage is you burn it on site in the same plant. Now, some of these facilities pretend they're going to turn it into liquid fuels or do other more creative things in the second stage, in which case it would not be considered an incinerator because you're doing the burning somewhere else, like in a vehicle or an airplane. But those are even more experimental and generally never work. So it's hard enough for them to get pyrolysis working, which is why you only see one small plant in the whole country even operating with that technology on sewage sludge from what we're hearing. So having looked into pyrolysis, gasification, and plasma arc, another similar incinerator in disguise, as we used to call them, these fancier types of incinerators, they can't run continuously. They run in batches usually at a very small pilot scale. They can't process heterogeneous feedstocks. Usually I'm talking about trash, so that's why I said that here. But even things that are more homogeneous, like tires, they've had a very hard problem. Even tires and plastics also, you think, well, that's pretty similar. It's not as diverse as trash. And yet they can't make those work very well either. And so sewage sludge is probably roughly about as homogeneous as tires might be. So I don't think they're going to have much more success there. And you have companies with no real history that usually have like a whiz-bang tech guy that meets up with the investor type that they get all excited about how they're going to solve the world's problems and make a bunch of money. And then they line up to get a patent. And I have another slide on that, I'll tell you, but in a second. But at the bottom here, you'll see they always have fantastic ideas too. They lie about their emissions. They claim that they have zero emissions, no smokestack. They have solid waste byproducts that everyone wants to buy, and there's zero waste because everyone wants everything coming out, which basically never is the case. Now, when I was presenting to an audience in an auditorium in Logansport, Indiana, several years ago, there was a proposal to build a huge pyrolysis plant for trash and tires. And someone came up to me from the audience afterwards, said he was a patent reviewer. And for the past 14 years, he had been seeing pyrolysis projects come. He said, none of them are legitimate. These are basically direct quotes from him. He says he sees a steady stream of guys in their 50s to 70s who just thought it was a great idea and come try to get patents, but none of them are legitimate. So I thought that was powerful coming from someone with that vantage point. It was also interesting to see EPA has a similar quote about how it hasn't worked out, but for tire pyrolysis, the biggest promoters of tire burning have admitted years ago, the road is littered with the carnage of people who are trying to make this technology viable. A lot of investments, and they just can't make it work. Here's the EPA quote. They're saying that they're inhibited by the high capital investment required and steep operating costs, and some of the same principles backed up in what we're seeing there. Now, I love this slide because I didn't make it. This came from the biggest promoters of burning everything in the country. And this is a solid waste consultancy out of Fairfax, Virginia, called Gershman, Brickner, and Bratton. And they present this slide every year, basically, when they present to industry conferences. So this one's 12 years old now, but for at least 5 more years, I've seen copies of these slides, and they use the same slide all the time. They talk about pyrolysis and gasification, which they recommend to local governments when they get hired to say, what should we do with our trash? And GBB comes back, burn it every time. And if it's not burning, it's turn it into liquid fuel to burn it somewhere else with some kind of pyrolysis usually. Well, that's what they tell to the local governments. But when they're talking to themselves in their industry conferences, they use this slide that shows that it's high risk. And they don't mean that they think it's high risk environmentally, because they don't think any kind of burning anything is bad for the environment from their perspective. But they're saying because of previous failures at scale, uncertain commercial potential, no operating experience with large-scale operations. This is still true today, 12 years later. This has been the same story for a while now. Now, when I was presenting recently, a few months ago in Hawaii, where they have a lot of promoters of biochar pushing very hard right now, I put some time into looking into science journals and seeing, well, what scientific articles are there about toxic chemicals in biochar? And it was a little hard to find because most of the articles you find are from scientists who are maybe having a conflict of interest, but for whatever reason, often excited about promoting biochar. Like you see any kind of academic research on combustion, usually it's by people who like playing with fire and are always saying good things about doing so. However, it's possible to find gems in that literature. For example, this one called The Dark Side of Black Gold, and they talked about how they couldn't meet the European standards for zinc and lead. And in another article about dioxins and furans, the most toxic chemicals known to science, they were finding that these kinds of persistent organic pollutants can significantly reduce the effectiveness of these biochar products and question their environmental safety. So one of the things I like to help debunk for communities is what I call the smokestack story. Because every time a company comes to a community and says, we're going to build this thing with a smokestack, but don't worry, this is basically the same story everywhere. They say, we're going to have continuous monitors, so we'll know what's coming out of our smokestack at all times. And DEC is this rigorous enforcer, and if we go over the limits, then they're going to fine us very heavily, and so you can trust we'll be within those limits. And those limits mean that's healthy and safe. Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So everyone gets the same story. So I want to walk you through how to debunk it. First of all, they're not always within permit limits. Fines are not enough. Oftentimes, they'll get either 0 fines or they'll get fines that are like a cost of doing business, basically. It's like an annoyance. They'll pay the fine and then they'll keep doing what they normally do. They also, incinerators can't meet, a lot of them can't meet modern limits. Now, this is more talking about trash incinerators. So you're going to be dealing with a facility that'll be held to so-called modern limits. But it sounds like those modern limits are pretty terrible if they only test once every 5 years. So we'll get back to that testing aspect in a moment. The permit limits are also not based on health and safety. They are technology-based standards. I've had multiple state regulators in different states tell me this. One we got on record, on video, in a public hearing saying, no, it's not based on health and safety. This is what the technology can do, and that's where we set our limit. It's not that there's a certain amount that comes out that is healthy or not healthy. Except that's the impression they give everyone. So it's important to be able to shoot back at that. And one of the ways you can shoot that down is by pointing out that the permit limits are concentration based. So if it was a plant that does, Tracy, help me out real quick. How many tons per day would this be? 400 or 500?
720 when it's fully built out.
Okay, thank you. So if you had a 100 ton per day Saratoga biochar plant, they'll be allowed to put a certain amount of pollution out in their permit. But if you have the one they're proposing that's over 700 tons per day, it gets to be 7 times dirtier, only because it's bigger. Because the permits are concentration based. The permit limits are always in parts per million or nanograms per dry standard cubic meter. It's always per something, as per the volume of air pollution coming out. And so If they're bigger, they can be dirtier, and that's just written into the design of the permits. It's not like there's a safe level that thou shalt not cross, and you can know that they will be within it. Now, I'm usually talking about trash incinerators, so Cavanta is specific to that. But there are companies out there that have been known to rig their stack tests, which are the once-a-year tests, and others, sometimes the same ones that have been known to rig their continuous monitors even, and have been busted for that in some cases. And there's no safe dose of a lot of chemicals that they put out, with lead, mercury, dioxins, radiation. If people are taking cancer treatments, that will end up in sewage sludge. They have radioactive components to sewage sludge as well. Fine particulate matter, there's scientific literature showing for these and numerous other chemicals that there is no safe level of it. So it doesn't matter what's in the permit, it can still harm you. And at most incinerators, there are only 3 pollutants that they have to continuously monitor. It might be even worse at this plant because it has a different type of technology they're using. But usually you see about 3, and that's ones that are not toxic. I'll get to that in a minute. I'll tell you which ones in a minute. So first, I want to share an analogy, and that is that if we regulated motorists on the highway the same way we regulate most pollutants from smokestacks in this country, we would let people drive around all year with no speedometer. And once a year, or in this case, maybe once every 5 years, on the highway, there will be a speed trap set, and there will be warning signs saying, warning, slow down, speed trap ahead. And then the brother of the driver will be running the speed trap because the companies hire their own consultants to do the testing. That is literally what we're facing now. When we have the technology to continuously monitor over 50 different pollutants, state governments are not requiring this. EPA is not requiring this, even in the new rules they're coming up with for trash incinerators that were about 15 years overdue. They are still not requiring continuous monitoring for more than 3 pollutants. They're making it an option. So the reason this is so important is that companies are speeding a lot of other days of the year when no one's looking. I know from looking at the biggest trash incinerator in the country, the data on the one near me, one of the ones near me, I found that this is one of the rare plants that does continuously monitor for hydrochloric acid. And they also do a once-a-year stack test. If you compare the numbers for how many pounds they say they're putting out each year of this chemical, the continuous monitors show that 62% higher than what you think it is when you test once a year under best behavior. And that is going on all around the country, except the monitoring isn't. So the numbers we're getting on how much is coming out of smokestacks is much lower than reality when they do this once every 1 to 5 year type of test. And with dioxins, it's even more stark. There are studies from Europe. One of them found that the actual levels, when they use continuous sampling, show that it's 32 to 52 times higher than what we think it is in the US when they test for 6 hours a year under best behavior. And another study up to almost 1,300 times higher. And those are the most toxic compounds known to science. This here shows at the trash incinerator in Hawaii that we're helping people fight. The colorful column, you'll see the green ones are the pollutants that they test continuously. Yellow ones are once a year, and the red ones are not at all. This is typical for a trash incinerator in the US. And this is stricter than what it looks like you're going to have at Saratoga Biochar. We're proposing a bill that would require them to continuously monitor all those ones in green in the next column. And we actually got a bill passed in Oregon last year that is going to require something very close to this. And we're working on getting the same thing passed in Hawaii right now. It'll be great to do the same in New York, although you have 10 trash incinerators there, so a lot more enemies to fight. But it's still necessary to get modern technology showing us how much is really being put into the air from these types of plants. So I'll leave it there, and I welcome any questions.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but we'll hear Michael after Mike. Any questions from Moreau for Mike? And I just would like to say in this little break that the DEC permit allows 7 pounds of PFOA to be emitted per year. And, you know, that's only one PFAS chemical. There's 15,000, and there's probably hundreds that would come out of their stacks. And the state drinking water standard is 10 parts per trillion. So how many parts per trillion when the PFOA and other PFAS are deposited on land and in water? How does that translate to parts per trillion? We have no idea, but it's going to be more than 10 parts per trillion when it gets in the water. Okay, next questions?
Yeah, would you consider the combination Hudson Falls Trash Plant and Biochar to be equivalent to Love Canal, which is still uninhabitable?
I think you're dealing with a little bit of apples and oranges only because the medium with Love Canal involving chemicals under people's homes. In these cases, you're talking about chemicals being put into the air. So one's going to dissipate a little bit better than stuff seeping into your basement. But nonetheless, being regularly exposed by inhalation, but also by the food you eat and drink. The fact that some of these chemicals love fat and hate water. I think Laura was talking about chemicals that are like this, and then they gravitate into the sludge. Dioxins, mercury, once it's methyl mercury, loves fat and hates water. These climb up the food chain. And so it's not just the ones in your area you have to worry about getting into your meat and dairy products that you consume, but the other 9 incinerators around the state and other ones in other regions, all building up in the food supply. So it's, yeah, part of it is locally a problem, but part of this stuff travels very far, and it's just a different type of problem.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mike? I'm sure we could have a discussion with you for hours, but the hour is getting late, and I'd like to turn it over to Michael Johanna, who is our attorney from Earth Justice. Earth Justice is a national environmental law organization, a nonprofit that represents communities that are threatened with pollution and other environmental harms. Thank you, Michael. Michael?
Sorry, can you hear me? And can you see my
Yes, we
screen?
can. Yes, it's working now.
Great. So I will be speaking during this presentation about process rather than legal substance. Basically, it's my goal here to help everyone in the audience understand what is happening during this notice and comment period for the state issued permits for the Saratoga Biochar facility, and how you can intervene in that regulatory process. And so right now we're in the midst of a notice and comment period that ends on March 4th. And during this notice and comment period, DEC is basically seeking your input, the community's input on 4 general determinations that it plans on making. And it has published several documents related to those determinations. And so I'll walk through those right now. So the first determination that they need to make is whether or not to grant an air state facility permit to Saratoga Biochar. And the purpose of that permit is to ensure that the facility is complying with emissions limits set by the state. And that it's able to comply with those emissions limits. And so the permit basically aims to protect air quality and to ensure, among other things, that the operation of the facility will not prevent the maintenance of one or more national ambient air quality standards. In relation to this permit determination, they've basically required Saratoga Biochar to publish its application materials for this permit, which are available online or by request from the Department of Environmental Conservation. And the Department of Environmental Conservation has also issued a draft permit with basically tentative permit limits. That's available for review as well. But DEC has not made a determination about whether or not to grant the permit. And so they're asking basically the public to review those materials and to, based on your knowledge about biochar and about this facility, to let them know what you think about their issuance of that permit. They're also trying to make a second determination regarding whether or not the facility and its operators are going to be complying with the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Now that act, under that act, DEC needs to make two determinations about this facility. They need to determine whether or not the facility is going to increase greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and therefore make our climate problem in the state worse than it already is. And they also need to determine whether or not the facility will disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And I'll come back to that later in the presentation. The third determination they need to make is whether or not to grant a solid waste management permit to the facility. And this permit basically, its purpose is to regulate the siting, design, construction, and operation of facilities that manage solid waste. As Tracy has mentioned at various points throughout this call, or throughout this meeting rather, this facility will be managing an enormous amount of solid waste, tens or hundreds of thousands of tons annually. And so among other things, the permit must require the permittee to manage odors and noise and ensure that there's sufficient space at the facility to manage this waste. Now, the final determination that the Department of Environmental Conservation is making over the course of this comment period is whether or not the product being produced at the facility has a beneficial use. This is called the beneficial use determination. The product that they're producing at the facility is biochar, as we've mentioned. Their application materials refer to biochar as carbon fertilizer, but they're referring to the treated sewage sludge that we've been talking about throughout this meeting when they say that. And so under the beneficial use determination standard, the Department of Environmental Conservation must determine, among other things, whether or not the biochar will be marketable and whether or not it's actually safe to apply to land. And so over the course of this meeting, you've all basically had a lot of information conveyed to you that will help you inform DEC about whether or not you think all of these standards have been met. I want to talk a little bit about the timeline here. And so we're in a public comment period. There's a written component where public comments are submitted in writing, and those written comments are due on March 4th. But there's also an oral component to public comments, which is there's going to be two hearings, one tomorrow and the next on Thursday. These are called legislative hearings by the Department of Environmental Conservation, and they give the public basically a little bit of time, if members of the public would prefer, to submit individual oral comments. And so the meeting tomorrow is going to be online over a Zoom-like platform called WebEx, and there's a link available to that online meeting on DEC's website and their environmental notice bulletin. These comments basically legally have the same effect as written comments, but because they are delivered orally, oftentimes they will get more press coverage than written comments. The trade-off, of course, is that with these comments, you tend to be time limited. And I'll get into the time limit in the next slide. Whereas with written comments, you can submit, hundreds of pages to the agency if you would like. There's also a possibility that after March 4th, there will be a second round of hearings called adjudicatory hearings. And these are more trial-like in nature. And they basically are used occasionally by permitting agencies to settle questions of fact that may not be settled over the course of the first comment period. But right now, the most important and most immediate set of oral comments to get involved with and thinking about intervening in are the comments tomorrow and Thursday. And then, so at the end of this written commenting process and these hearings, DEC will finally make its determination about whether or not to issue the permits I mentioned earlier, and it will also make the legal determinations I mentioned in the previous slides. Basically, the agency DEC has the choice whether or not to deny the permits, to issue them, or to issue them with modifications. And so they may take the draft permits that are available on their website and say, you know, we are going to issue these, but commenters, you've identified serious problems with how we originally wrote them, and so we're making all of these major revisions to the permits, or they may deny them. When the Department of Environmental Conservation makes this determination to issue or deny, that determination is subject to judicial review. Now, what does that mean? That means that anybody who has commented on the permits has an opportunity to basically make a decision to hire a lawyer and file a lawsuit based on their comments. You can't file a lawsuit based on something you haven't commented on, but so long as you've exhausted the opportunity to comment, the court will hear you out, basically. And this is known as a doctrine called administrative exhaustion. And it also underscores why it is important to comment if you do intend to avail yourself of the courts at some point during a permitting process. So I want to talk a bit about what comments generally and in general terms tend to include, what are sort of best practices for commenting in very broad terms. So in this particular hearing, the hearing that's happening tomorrow and the second hearing that's happening on Thursday, your comments are limited to 3 minutes. So if you're coming up with talking points for these comments, you should make sure that the talking points, you know, are not too voluminous, and you should maybe practice a couple of times, maybe with family members or in front of the mirror, just and time yourself to make sure that you're not going way over 3 minutes. Written comments, as I mentioned in the previous slide, they can be as many pages as you would like. And actually, you can submit multiple written comments. So if you submit something on Friday in written comment form to the Department of Environmental Conservation, and then come up with a whole bunch of other ideas on Monday, you can submit one comment on Friday and another comment on Monday to DEC, and you can keep doing that. There's no minimum age for submitting comments to DEC up until March 4th. So, you know, even kids can participate in the hearings over the next couple of days. You don't need to be a scientist to submit comments. You don't need to be a lawyer to submit comments. In fact, you don't need to be any kind of expert at all. You can just be an ordinary citizen who has concerns about this project. And this is an opportunity, and it may be your only opportunity to let DEC know what your concerns are before these permits are finalized, basically. And it's best generally when you're writing comments to just be clear about what your concerns with the facility are. So you should explain the basis of your opposition to a permit. And you should identify the specific grounds that could lead the Department of Environmental Conservation to deny the permit or to impose significant conditions on the permit if you are aware of those grounds. Now, I wanted to dedicate one slide to talking a bit about disadvantaged communities. As I mentioned earlier, one of the determinations that the Department of Environmental Conservation needs to make over the course of this notice and comment period is, and in response to the hearings tomorrow and Thursday, is whether or not the Saratoga Biochar facility will disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. Now, this is a technical term that is determined almost via an algorithm by looking at many indicators of health and pollution burdens across census tracts throughout New York State. And basically, a regulatory body at the state level crunches a bunch of numbers, and after they're done crunching those numbers, they basically make a determination that certain communities are disadvantaged and certain communities are not disadvantaged. It's not a value judgment on the community, but what it does do is it grants those communities basically extra legal protections from projects that need to be permitted, such as the Saratoga Biochar facility. I was looking at some of the data that the state regulatory body used to make its determination that Hudson Falls, which is the disadvantaged community you can see in the census tract on the right on the map at the bottom of this slide, that the state used in making the determination that that was a disadvantaged community. And also the data that they used to make the determination that Glens Falls on the left of the screen had a disadvantaged community contained within it in the census tract on the left. And what I found in reviewing some of that data is that these communities really are on the margin of being advantaged or disadvantaged when it comes to the health burdens they already carry. They are very, very heavily burdened, at least for the indicators tracked by the state regulatory body along measurements of their health burden. And so, for example, Hudson Falls is above the 90th percentile for basically incidents where people go to urgent care for COPD related respiratory issues when compared to every other census tract in the state. The similar picture in Glens Falls, it's an outlier in the state for heart attacks and for COPD hospital visits, a really dramatic outlier. And so I think one question that the Department of Environmental Conservation is going to have to answer over the course of this process of reading through your notice and reading through your comments and listening to your oral comments is whether or not, notwithstanding all of the other health burdens that may arise from this project based on the presentations that we just heard, whether or not this is a good community to house this project, given everything that you're already dealing with and all the axes along which you're already disadvantaged. And so with that, I will conclude my presentation and open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. I just want to say the Glens Falls census tract that is a disadvantaged community is from the Hyde collection across Warren Street. And so if you know anyone in that census tract, if you could reach, or you have family that live there, if you could reach out to them, encourage them to write comments, say where they live, say that they're in the disadvantaged community. We have sent maps and some sample comments that Michael has put together to everyone on the Clean Air Action Network mailing list. If you did not get it, two things to do. One, look in your spam folder. And two, we might not have the right spelling of your email address. So you can contact me. I will give you my phone number. You can contact me and spell your email address. Or if you're not on the list, I will make sure you get it. 518-692-8242. And also, these are posted on the Not Moreau Facebook page. And we have some other guidance on writing comments that is on our website. And so that was sent out yesterday around 10 o'clock. So check your spam folder, check your email. And we also are giving out at both at the Strand Theater and the Moreau Community Center, a listing of where the hearings are, how to get on, how to register for the online hearing tomorrow, how to call in, who to write the comments to, either if you're emailing them or mailing them. So make sure you pick up that flyer so that you have that information. You do need to register for the online hearing tomorrow, but it takes about 2 minutes. All they ask for are three things: your name, your email address, and whether you want to speak. That's all. And you could also, I think, just get on. There's a phone number. I don't think you have to register for that. I'm not really clear. But they do want to make it accessible to people who do not have email. So, any questions from Moreau?
Tracy, yes, there's a question. Is there a guarantee that all comments will be read?
They say they read them, and they do have to, Michael, you can explain this. They're supposed to do responses to all the comments, correct?
That's right. They're required by law to review all of the comments, including the oral comments, and to give them all equal weight. They're required to respond to comments. Sometimes regulatory agencies respond to comments in batches. And so, if a bunch of people are raising concerns about land application of sewage sludge and the concerns all sound pretty similar, it won't respond to them each individually. It'll have one generalized response to that set of concerns,
Right.
but it
Not
does need to respond. Yeah.
And not to
And
say
then-
this, your comments should not be about land application of sewage sludge, maybe land application of sewage sludge biochar, but yes.
That's right.
Yes.
And then a follow-up to that is, if you do a comment at the public hearing, can you still provide a written comment?
Absolutely. And what's typical is people summarize their written comments. They make them short because you only have 3 minutes, and then you do extensive comments in writing if you feel like it.
If I can add to this, strategically, it's important to understand the difference between what they're listening for and who else is in your audience. The people who show up from an agency and sit at the front of the room, they're listening for someone to say something that gives them a technical basis to say yes or no. Well, to say no, rather, because otherwise the default is they rubber stamp it yes. And that's probably what will happen, because that's what happens everywhere. But they're looking for someone to say on page 37, line 29, that should say 0.08 parts per million instead of 0.09. And then they're going to write that down and check on that. All right. But most people are not equipped to give that kind of testimony. And unless they hire the wrong people and just can't fill out an application correctly, there are not necessarily those silver bullets to find and go after them with anyway. So it's important to recognize that most of the things that everyone will want to say and think that makes sense to say is something that the folks in the front of the room are going to blow off in their response to the comments and say, well, your kid's cancer is not relevant in our permitting process. Sorry, we're not allowed to consider that. If there are a lot of people with asthma in the community, sorry, that's outside of our scope. And that's what they're going to do when they go ahead and rubber stamp the permit after they respond to your comments and basically explain to you to some level on why they're ignoring almost or every single one. So strategically, going in knowing that, it's important not to necessarily get up and shoot at the most technical stuff you have. If you have that, great, put it in writing. But when you're in person, use the opportunity to speak to any media that show up, to the audience members that show up, even if you have to face them yourselves and not face the officials in the front of the room, which might annoy them, but it can be powerful to do that, because the exercise here is to get folks in the community understanding that DEC is not there to protect them, that this is not the place to win. And that's going to help you then get people to the next step, which involves how do you defeat this at the local level when DEC goes ahead and rubber stamps this. So I'm not trying to sound cynical. I've just been around the block with this for over 30 years. This is how it plays out. And just understand that there's a difference between the audience in the front of the room and the audience behind you.
A little bit about logistics. At the hearing, you will go up to a podium. There will be a microphone, and they will start the timer when you open your mouth. And you will be talking to the audience and also probably the administrative law judge or the DEC officials that are there, the DEC employees. I mean, I spoke at one of these last summer for renewing a permit for the biggest construction and demolition landfill in the state, which is next to a K through 12 school. You know, and I don't know, I don't think any decision has been made yet, but overwhelming like this, overwhelming community opposition. But just remember, if DEC grants the permits, this project still will not automatically go through. So do not despair. And Michael Johanna is with us because there is possibility of litigation and also advocacy, and he's doing some great advocacy for us. Any other questions from here? Anyone have a question? Okay, there was one other, let me just ask if there's any panelists who want to make any final statements. And I know we've gone way over time, and I thank everyone, and we will put this recording up tonight or by tomorrow morning. And check our website, Clean Air Action Network, check Not Moreau, and feel free to call me or call others that are involved if you need help. There's plenty of time for written comments. So we're really focusing on the hearings. And I hope everyone will show up and try to get 5 other people to show up with them at the South Glens Falls High School public DEC hearing on Thursday night at 6 p.m. That's really important to get a really large crowd. It's a big auditorium. And people do not have to speak. If you know, 500 people showed up, they couldn't all speak. So, you know, if 50 people speak, that would be fabulous. But if 500 people show up, that would be wonderful. Absolutely great. So anything else that anyone wants to say, feel free. Otherwise, we'll close and wish everyone good night and energy for the hearings. Anything else? Going once? Going twice? You all were very helpful, very informative, and I'm really happy that you were willing to come and speak to us. So, shall we say goodbye? Okay, I'll turn off this, I'll say goodnight, and we'll be in touch. Night.